I don't listen very well. I tend to interrupt people or talk over them, assuming I already know what they're going to say. Of course, this is very Jewish. Many of us finish other people's sentences for them or nod our heads in exasperation while others are talking, as if to say, I got the point already, you can stop. Yet listening is a central part of our tradition. Tashma, say the rabbis, come and listen, when they want us to attend to an authoritative text. And Shema, listen, is of course the first word in our central statement of faith. Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. What is listening? Well, in the first place, listening is a matter of following along with what someone else is saying and trying to make sense of it in our own terms. What might a thoughtful and reasonable person mean by that, we ask ourselves, especially when we hear something puzzling. Which in the first instance means, what might I mean by that, if I were being thoughtful and reasonable? From which arises the temptation to suppose that we already know where the other person is going. But the other side of listening is, of course, not to assume that we already know where the other person is going, to open ourselves instead to what's unexpected, what might even seem odd to us about what the other is saying. Only then can we ever hear anything that might correct what we already think and feel. Sometimes that means we'll hear something painful, hard truths about ourselves, perhaps, that we've been hiding from. At other times, it simply means that we'll hear something new. In any case, opening ourselves to what's unexpected in what others say allows those others to appear to us as they are, rather than as we simply think they are or want them to be. It allows for real connection with other people in all their differences from us. So, listening is a matter of a delicate balance between, on the one hand, making sense of other people in our own terms, and on the other hand, opening ourselves to what doesn't fit into those terms. Both of these efforts require humility. We need to make sense of things that at first may seem ridiculous to us, and we need at the same time to allow others to correct us, to surprise us, and simply to be different from us. Jewish mysticism teaches that God needed to restrain God's self, engage in tzimtzum, or contraction, in order to create the universe. Otherwise, there'd be no space for the universe. God would fill everything. When we listen, we also need to engage in tzimtzum in order to make space for the other. Most religious traditions, including ours, call for this kind of listening to a sacred text, to the Gospels, to the Quran, in our case, to the Torah. If we do that, it's said, we can hear God speaking to us through them. I've always found this idea tremendously exciting. Imagine if God could correct us, surprise us, appear to us in all God's differences from us. What rich meaning that would give to Jewish practice. But can we do that today to the Torah? In former years, Jews believed that God spoke the whole Torah to Moses, who wrote it down exactly as he heard it. Nowadays, we're taught that's not true. Historical scholarship of the Torah tells us that instead it was written over many centuries by a long series of scribes and priests in pursuit of their own agendas and with their own superstitions and moral views, many of which are very alien to us. And in fact, the Torah contains passages that are very alien to us. It even tells us at one point to stone our stubborn and rebellious sons. How can we possibly listen attentively to a text like that today? Well, it may be some comfort to realize that this is not, in fact, a new problem, not just a problem of today. Our rabbis have been struggling with it for centuries. Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and jurist who lived almost 900 years ago, long before there was any historical scholarship of the Torah, Maimonides was already struggling with this problem. Now, Maimonides does say in his 8th principle of faith that God spoke the whole Torah to Moses, and Moses wrote it all down like a faithful scribe. But Maimonides didn't really believe that. He couldn't believe it. Maimonides didn't believe that anyone could hear God, that God can speak. Maimonides also didn't believe that God can change. That means, among other things, that God can't be doing one thing one day and something else the next. So God can't, for instance, be up in heaven on Thursday and then come down on Friday to Mount Sinai for a chat about some commandments. So Maimonides can't possibly mean literally what he says about the composition of the Torah in the eighth principle of faith. And if we look closely at that principle, we'll find that in fact he puts in various qualifiers to indicate that he doesn't mean to be taken literally. And yet, in that same eighth principle of faith, Maimonides tells us to take the entire Torah as divine, not to dismiss a single verse, even a single letter, as merely human. For in every verse and every letter, says Maimonides, there are wisdom and wonders to be found for those with the wisdom to find them. Notice, we need wisdom to find wisdom. What does Maimonides mean by that? I suggest that by the wisdom to find wisdom, Maimonides means exactly what I've called the virtues of good listening. For if we look at Maimonides' account of prophecy, and the prophet for Maimonides is precisely someone who listens to God, in some sense, we find exactly the two-sided process of listening that I've described. On the one hand, says Maimonides, the prophet needs to figure out what God is like and what God would likely teach us were God somehow to communicate with us. Needs to make sense of what God would say in the prophet's own terms. On the other hand, the prophet needs, according to Maimonides, a deep humility, and needs in particular to be humble enough not to assume that what God would teach is just what the prophet, himself or herself, wants God to teach. Applied to how we read the Torah, this suggests that we need both to come to it with some idea of what God might teach us through it, and at the same time to refrain from assuming that what it has to teach is just what we want it to teach. If we do that, then the Torah can become God's word for us, however it was composed. Can we still do that today? Can we still learn wisdom and wonders from this strange old book? Every once in a while, I take a pair of trousers or a jacket to a shatnez checker to have it looked over to see whether it contains any combination of wool and linen, which is forbidden by the Torah. Sometimes I've had to throw out a jacket I particularly liked as a result. More often, the jacket simply comes back with a big label sewn in it saying non-shatnez. Actually, this jacket has such a label. So do all my jackets, but occasionally friends see this label, and then they look at me as if I'm really weird. And I feel really weird keeping this practice. But you know, weirdness is part of the point. We Jews are a weird people, living on the margins of various societies for most of our history who regarded us as irrational because of our practices. But marginality has advantages. African Americans and gay people and other minorities in America are often able to see things about the majority that the majority can't see itself. We Jews too, if we cling to our weirdness, can and do see things about the majority that the majority doesn't see. We're also able to empathize with other minorities, other groups who live on the margins. When I hear that Sikh men say, "Don't cut their hair," or that Mormons wear sacred undergarments, I feel a certain kinship with them because of shatnez. So much for the openness to the unexpected, openness to the odd side of listening. How about the making sense side? Can we make sense of shatnez? Well, wool and linen are characteristic products of pastoral and agricultural societies respectively, and those societies have fought with one another for centuries. The first murder in the Torah, between Cain and Abel, reflects a struggle between farmers and shepherds. So perhaps, by not wearing shatnez, we are making ourselves mindful of the sources of human violence. Is that really the meaning of shatnez? I have no idea. I'm just speculating. But by listening to shatnez, by keeping this bit of the Torah, I'm prodded constantly into such speculations, into trying to make sense of it in my own terms. And that itself seems worthwhile. Let's try a more challenging example, the stubborn and rebellious son. In this case, I've had very little success trying to make sense of the relevant passage in the Torah on my own. But we Jews don't listen alone. We don't just listen alone, at least. We listen together with a community. And if we turn to our community, in this case in particular to the rabbis of the Talmud, I think we can get some help. In the first place, the rabbis of the Talmud are clearly bothered by exactly what bothers us. How can a good God possibly command something like this? So they struggle to make moral sense of it in their own terms. They read various conditions into the son to whom the law is supposed to apply. Then they focus on a single verse in the passage. The father and the mother are to come to the elders who are sitting in the gates of the city and say to them, "This our son does not obey our voice." And the rabbis pounce on the word voice, on the fact that it's in the singular rather than the plural. Our voice, not our voices. That means, say the rabbis, that the father and the mother have to have the same voice. But men and women never have the same voice, so the law can't be applied. The rabbis conclude that the law isn't meant to be applied, that it's in the Torah simply as an object lesson of some kind. Well, that's a pretty thoroughgoing version of the making sense in one's own terms side of listening. But Rabbi Yonatan thinks, as perhaps some of you are thinking, that the other rabbis have gone too far in this direction, that they are no longer listening to what's unexpected, what's bizarre and horrifying in these verses, that they're essentially finishing the Torah's sentences for it. Rabbi Yonatan says, "I saw a stubborn and rebellious son, and I sat on his grave." Did he really? Well, Rabbi Yonatan is given to this kind of pronouncement. In the case of another appalling law, commanding us to wipe out entire idolatrous cities, the other rabbis also say, it can't be applied, it was never meant to be applied, it's in the Torah just as an object lesson of some kind. And Rabbi Yonatan also says, "I saw it, and I sat on its ashes." So here are two things, each of which the other rabbis think never took place at all. Yet Rabbi Yonatan claims to have seen both of them in one lifetime. I don't think Rabbi Yonatan himself expects to be taken literally. He's simply prodding the other rabbis to take seriously what's darkly unexpected about these verses, to take seriously the possibility of radical evil, of a son or a city so evil that, yes, they do have to be treated this way. I take this entire argument between Rabbi Yonatan and the other rabbis to model for us good listening. On the one hand, you have people who are trying to make sense of the passage in their own moral terms, and on the other hand, you have someone who insists on what doesn't make sense in it, what sticks in our throat about it. And I take the point of the law about the stubborn and rebellious son to be precisely to spark such arguments, which indeed flare up to this day every time a Jewish community discusses this passage. You'll find some people who try to make moral sense of it, while others insist on what doesn't make sense about it, what's undigestible. And that prods us to discuss radical evil and how we should respond to it, which is something we should discuss. So, listening to every verse in the Torah needn't mean doing what it says. It just means searching, with all the humility we can muster, for the wisdom and wonders to be found in it. That's difficult. I find it challenging myself to this day. But insofar as we can do that, we can break out of ourselves, open ourselves to what's new and unexpected, and connect ourselves to the other members of our community in all their differences from us. And if we can do those things, we just may also connect ourselves to God in all God's differences from us. Tashma, come and listen. Thank you.